The transport shuttle's engines whined like a dying cat. As ambassador, Thomas Hartley pressed his face against the viewport, watching Velthara Prime grow from a distant blue marble into a crystalline wonderland that defied every law of physics he thought he understood. Spires of living crystal twisted skyward like frozen tornadoes, pulsing with soft, bioluminescent patterns that seemed to respond to the triple moons hanging in the amber sky like cosmic ornaments. First time seeing a quantum-grown city, Ambassador. Captain Rodriguez asked from the pilot's seat, her fingers dancing across holographic controls that flickered between dimensions. First time seeing anything that shouldn't exist, Thomas muttered, adjusting his diplomatic collar for the 100th time. The fabric was embedded with translation nanites that supposedly would help him avoid accidentally declaring war through improper grammar. Are you absolutely sure these crystals won't collapse the moment I sneeze? The Velthari have been growing their cities for 3,000 years. I think they've figured out structural integrity. Rodriguez's grin suggested she'd heard this question from every human diplomat. Though I'd avoid sneezing on the royal twins. Apparently, their biology is so synchronized that if one catches a cold, the other one starts producing antibodies. Thomas felt his stomach perform a gravitational slingshot maneuver that had nothing to do with the shuttle's descent. The twin princesses, Lyrale and Zyrale, were his primary assignment. Forge diplomatic relations with the designated heir, Lyrale, while maintaining cordial relations with her sister. Simple enough, except every briefing document contained footnotes longer than the actual instructions, all dealing with the apparently Byzantine complexity of Velthari twin dynamics. The shuttle touched down on a landing pad that seemed to be made of compressed starlight, sending ripples of aurora-colored energy across its surface. Thomas gathered his luggage, which consisted mainly of Earth delicacies that his cultural advisor had sworn would impress alien royalty, and stepped onto a world where the very air hummed with quantum frequencies. His first breath tasted like electricity and honey. Ambassador Thomas Hartley of Earth, announced a figure gliding toward him across the crystalline plaza. The being appeared remarkably human, elegant and graceful, except for the pointed ears that curved delicately upward like natural art pieces, their tips adorned with intricate silver patterns that seemed to shift in the strange light. I am Counselor Vithais, your cultural liaison. Thomas extended his hand for a shake, then remembered the briefing about Velthari greeting customs and quickly shifted to the prescribed gesture of touching his fingertips to his temples. Unfortunately, he'd forgotten which temples, and ended up looking like he was trying to squeeze a particularly stubborn headache out of his skull. Close enough, Vithais said with what might have been amusement, his ear markings flickering briefly. The princesses are eager to meet you, though I should warn you that today's triple moon alignment may cause some visual complications. Visual complications. The light patterns can make distinguishing between the twins somewhat challenging for species that rely primarily on standard visual spectrum recognition. Vithais gestured toward the towering crystal palace ahead, where the three moons' combined radiance created a kaleidoscope of shifting shadows. Princess Lyrale bears ascending silver spirals on her ear tips, while Princess Zyrale's spirals descend. However, during certain lunar phases, the patterns can appear to invert themselves to untrained eyes. Thomas felt his diplomatic confidence crumble like a cookie in a black hole. So you're telling me I might not be able to tell them apart? Consider it an opportunity to develop your other senses. The Velthari appreciate those who can perceive beyond mere appearance. They walked through gardens where flowers sang in harmonious frequencies and trees grew in perfect mathematical spirals. Thomas tried to look dignified while secretly wondering if his insurance covered accidental diplomatic incidents caused by mistaken identity. The palace loomed ahead, its crystalline walls alive with bioluminescent displays that seemed to be running some kind of quantum calculation. In the grand reception hall, Thomas found himself face to face with two beings of such identical beauty that his brain immediately gave up trying to process the difference. Both princesses wore flowing garments that seemed to be woven from captured moonbeams. Their elongated ears, adorned with silver markings that twisted and curved in patterns that hurt his eyes to follow directly. "Your Highness," Thomas said, bowing toward what he hoped was Lyrelay based on an elaborate system of position guessing he devised during the 30-second walk across the hall. "Welcome to Velthara Prime, Ambassador," replied the princess on the left, her voice like musical crystal chimes. "I am Princess Lyrelay." Thomas felt relief flood through him, until the princess on the right stepped forward with an identical smile. "And I am Princess Zyrelay. We are both delighted by your arrival." The two sisters exchanged a glance that seemed to carry entire conversations in the space between heartbeats. Their ear markings flickered in patterns that were definitely some form of communication, though Thomas's nanites were apparently not programmed for biochemical light speak. "Perhaps," Lyrelay continued, "you would join me for a tour of our quantum gardens. The bioluminescent displays are particularly spectacular when viewed during the convergence of three lights." "That would be wonderful," Thomas replied, then immediately second-guessed himself. Had Zyrelay been the one speaking? The shifting moonlight through the crystal ceiling was playing havoc with the silver patterns on their ears, making them seem to dance and invert with each passing shadow. As they walked through corridors where the walls hummed with living energy, Thomas found himself in conversation with whichever princess had invited him, discussing Earth's agricultural techniques and the fascinating challenge of growing crops in quantum-enhanced soil. She laughed at his description of humanity's primitive farming methods, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Your species' approach to cultivation is charmingly linear," she said, pausing beside a fountain where water flowed upward in helical patterns. "We have found that plants respond much better to multidimensional encouragement." Multidimensional encouragement. We sing to them in frequencies that exist across several planes of reality simultaneously. Her eyes sparkled with mischief. "Would you like to try?" Before Thomas could protest, she guided his hands toward a cluster of flowers that seemed to be made of crystallized music. The moment his fingers touched the petals, the entire garden erupted in a symphony of color and light that made his soul ache with beauty. "I think they like you," she said softly, and Thomas realized that somewhere between the quantum fountains and the singing flowers, this had stopped feeling like a diplomatic mission and started feeling like something else entirely. As evening approached and the three moons began their nightly dance across the sky, she offered him a ceremonial drink from a chalice that seemed to contain liquid starlight. "A traditional sharing between new allies," she explained. Thomas accepted the cup, unaware that across the crystal garden, another figure watched with ear markings that pulsed with emotions he had not yet learned to read. 3 weeks into his diplomatic assignment, Thomas had developed what he generously called a routine, though it resembled organized chaos more than any schedule Earth's foreign ministry would recognize. The Velthari concept of time flowed like quantum honey, thick, golden, and completely unpredictable. Their 47-hour days meant he was constantly jet-lagged in a way that transcended mere circadian rhythms and entered the realm of temporal vertigo. "Good morning, Ambassador," Lyrelay greeted him in the crystal breakfast alcove, where the walls hummed with gentle harmonics designed to aid digestion. At least, he was reasonably certain it was Lyrelay. The morning light streaming through the biocrystalline windows made her ear markings appear to spiral upward, though he'd learned that Velthari silver could be as deceptive as Earth politicians during election season. "Morning," Thomas replied, carefully avoiding any pronouns that might reveal his uncertainty. He discovered that the Velthari language had 17 different forms of address, depending on which sister he was speaking to, the phase of the triple moons, and whether they were in formal or informal quantum resonance. His translation nanites had given up trying to sort it out, and now just flashed error messages, whenever he attempted anything more complex than asking for directions to the bathroom. She laughed, a sound that made the crystal walls chime in sympathetic harmony. "You're learning to speak like us, carefully and with magnificent ambiguity. I find it endearing." Thomas nearly choked on his breakfast, which appeared to be some kind of fruit that tasted like cinnamon dreams and existed in 3 dimensions simultaneously. "I'm just trying not to accidentally propose marriage or declare war on your neighbor's system." "Oh, you'd know if you were doing either. Marriage proposals require a formal quantum entanglement ceremony, and declaring war involves singing the death song of infinite sorrows while standing naked under all 3 moons. Her ear markings flickered with what he'd learned to recognize as amusement. "Though I should warn you that humming in the palace gardens can sometimes be misinterpreted as mild territorial aggression." They spent the morning touring the bioluminescent districts where the Velthari grew their technology rather than manufacturing it. Buildings pulsed with living light, their walls breathing in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat that Thomas could almost feel in his bones. His companion explained how they coaxed quantum processors from crystalline seeds, nurturing them in gardens of pure mathematics, until they bloomed into computers that could calculate probability clouds and dream in binary poetry. "Your technology seems to blur the line between science and magic," Thomas observed, watching a technician sing a growth formula to a cluster of developing processors. "Magic is just science that hasn't learned to explain itself properly," she replied, guiding him past fountains that defied gravity by sheer force of aesthetic stubbornness. "Your people build machines. We grow partnerships." Thomas tried to process this philosophical distinction, while simultaneously attempting to operate a Velthari biointerface that had been designed for beings with naturally intuitive quantum awareness. The device, which resembled a cross between a seashell and a mathematical equation made flesh, was supposed to regulate the palace's atmospheric harmony. Instead, his clumsy human brain somehow convinced it that the optimal breathing mixture for the royal gardens was 90% helium. Within minutes, every Velthari in a 50-meter radius sounded like cartoon characters having existential crises about the nature of reality. Counselor Vithais approached them speaking in a voice that could have narrated children's entertainment broadcasts, his dignified demeanor completely undermined by his sudden resemblance to an animated chipmunk. "Ambassador," he squeaked with wounded pride, "while your creative approach to atmospheric modification is innovative, perhaps we might return the air to its traditional quantum balance." Thomas fumbled with the biointerface, while his companion doubled over with laughter that sounded like silver bells being tickled by hyperactive pixies. The more he tried to fix his mistake, the worse it became, until half the palace guard was marching around speaking in voices that would have made opera singers weep with envy for their impossible pitch. "Here," she said, placing her hands over his on the biointerface. "You're thinking too linearly. Quantum systems respond to intention, not just instruction. Feel what you want the air to become." The moment her fingers touched his, Thomas experienced something that definitely wasn't covered in any diplomatic manual. A warm sensation flowed through his consciousness, and suddenly he could sense the quantum fluctuations that powered everything around them. The biointerface purred under their combined touch, and gradually the helium-saturated atmosphere returned to normal, leaving only the memory of very dignified aliens sounding like cartoon characters. "Better," she said softly, but didn't immediately remove her hands from his. "You're learning to think in multiple dimensions. It's quite attractive in a primitively charming way." "Primitively charming," Thomas repeated. "I'm definitely putting that on my diplomatic resume." That evening, during what the Velthari called the shadow hours, when all 3 moons aligned and cast the world in ethereal blue light, they walked through the palace's quantum meditation chambers. The rooms were designed to enhance emotional resonance between compatible consciousnesses, and Thomas found himself sharing thoughts and feelings with an intimacy that transcended language barriers. "Your species dreams of stars," she murmured as they sat in a chamber where the walls displayed swirling galaxies of possibility. "I can sense it in your quantum signature. You're explorers by nature." "And your people dream of harmony," Thomas replied, surprised by his own insight. "Every thought you have is connected to maintaining balance." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the wall displays shift through probability clouds of potential futures. Some showed human and Velthari colonies among distant stars. Others depicted vast crystal cities floating through space like cosmic gardens. Thomas felt a strange certainty that these weren't just artistic representations. They were glimpses of what could be. "The future is negotiable," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "Every choice creates new possibilities." Later, as they prepared to part ways for the night, she offered him a gift, a small crystal that pulsed with soft light and hummed with quantum frequencies. "A harmony stone," she explained. "It will help you understand our ways more deeply. Keep it with you always." Thomas accepted the crystal, feeling its warm energy resonate with something deep in his consciousness. As he walked back to his quarters through corridors that glowed with bioluminescent murals depicting the history of both their species, he felt a profound connection forming, not just to his mysterious companion, but to this entire alien civilization that somehow felt like coming home. What he didn't notice, as he passed through the crystal garden where moonlight played tricks with shadows and reflections, was another figure watching from behind the quantum fountains, her elongated ears adorned with silver markings that spiraled in the opposite direction, pulsing with emotions that the night's strange light couldn't quite conceal. The revelation hit Thomas like a quantum torpedo aimed directly at his diplomatic career. He sat in the medical chamber, a crystalline room that hummed with bioscanners and healing frequencies, watching two identical faces that suddenly seemed as different as binary stars in opposing orbits. "So let me get this straight," Thomas said, his voice cracking like a teenager asking someone to prom. "You're Zyrale, the younger twin. I've been courting you for 3 weeks. And Princess Lyrale, my actual diplomatic assignment, has been watching this entire romantic catastrophe unfold from the sidelines like some kind of quantum soap opera." Zyrale's ear markings pulsed with colors that his translation nanites helpfully identified as guilty amusement mixed with defensive pride, and a touch of morning sickness. The morning sickness part made his stomach perform gymnastics that would have impressed Olympic judges. "In my defense," Zyrale said, placing a protective hand over her abdomen where their hybrid child was apparently developing at a rate that defied human biology, "you never actually asked which twin you were talking to. I assumed you knew, and were simply being diplomatically tactful." "Diplomatically tactful," Thomas repeated weakly. "I've accidentally started a biological alliance with the wrong member of alien royalty because I was too embarrassed to admit I couldn't tell you apart." Dr. Zephes, the Velthari physician whose ear markings identified him as clinically fascinated but personally mortified, cleared his throat in a way that sounded like wind chimes caught in a gentle "Quantum consciousness," Thomas echoed. "My child is going to be smarter than me before it's born." "Most children are," Zyrale said with a grin that made her ear markings sparkle. "The difference is that ours will be able to prove it mathematically." The chamber door chimed with harmonics that announced royal presence, and Princess Lyrale entered with the kind of controlled grace that suggested she was either completely calm or suppressing the urge to throw Thomas into the nearest black hole. Her ear markings displayed a pattern he'd never seen before, complex spirals that seemed to fold in on themselves like emotional origami. "Sister," Lyrale said, her voice carrying undertones that made the crystal walls resonate with barely contained tension. "Ambassador, I trust the medical examination has confirmed what our quantum resonance already revealed." Thomas stood awkwardly, bumping into a bioscanner that immediately began analyzing his stress hormones and broadcasting the results as a light show across the ceiling. According to the display, his anxiety levels were approaching critical mass. "Your Highness," he began, then stopped because every diplomatic protocol he'd memorized seemed laughably inadequate for the situation. "I should probably start with an apology, followed by several more apologies, and then maybe some traditional earth groveling." "Groveling won't be necessary," Lyreley said, though her ear markings suggested she might find it amusing. "However, we do have a rather complex situation to resolve." Dr. Zephy's activated a holographic display that showed two humanoid figures connected by flowing streams of quantum energy. The twin bond is fundamental to Velthari royal biology. When one sister experiences significant life changes, the other must maintain balance or risk severing their connection permanently. "Which means?" Thomas asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer would require him to update his insurance coverage. "Which means," Lyreley said with the kind of smile that could cut diamond, "that for the royal succession to remain stable, both twins must bear children within the same quantum cycle, or our bloodline loses its claim to the throne." Thomas felt his diplomatic training collapse like a house of cards in a hurricane. "You're saying you both need to be pregnant, simultaneously, with my children. The mathematics of royal succession are quite elegant, really," Zyreley added helpfully. "Two sisters, two children, perfect quantum balance. It's practically a natural law." "Natural law," Thomas muttered, watching the bioscanner's stress display shift from amber to red to colors that probably didn't exist on Earth. "Right. So I've gone from diplomatic liaison to, what exactly?" "Royal consort to both princesses," Dr. Zephy said with clinical precision. "Congratulations. I believe your species has a tradition of celebrating such occasions with fermented beverages and loud music. We also have a tradition of running away screaming, but I suppose that wouldn't be very diplomatic." Counselor Vithais chose that moment to glide into the chamber, his ear markings displaying what Thomas had learned to recognize as barely contained panic mixed with professional obligation. "Ambassador, I've just received word from the High Council. They're requesting a formal explanation of the unprecedented biological situation." "How formal?" Thomas asked. "The kind that involves standing before the assembled nobility of 3-star systems while they debate whether you've triggered an evolutionary leap or accidentally started an interstellar incident," Vithais replied. "Also, they want to know if you require ceremonial robes, or if human diplomatic attire will suffice for the ritual of reproductive accountability." "The what now?" Zyreley and Lyreley exchanged one of their quantum-entangled glances, and both began laughing simultaneously, a sound like crystal bells being played by a cosmic symphony orchestra. Their synchronized amusement made the medical chamber's bioluminescent walls pulse in rhythm, creating a light show that was probably visible from orbit. "Thomas," Lyreley said when she'd recovered enough to speak, "you've managed to stumble into the most complex romantic situation in Velthari history, accidentally triggered ancient reproduction protocols that haven't been used in centuries, and somehow convinced our planetary government to convene an emergency session about interspecies compatibility. I'm actually impressed. Impressed enough to not throw me into a quantum recycling unit. Impressed enough to consider that perhaps the universe has a sense of humor about diplomatic relations," she replied, stepping closer with the kind of grace that made Thomas forget how to breathe properly. "The question is whether you're prepared to embrace a future that's considerably more complicated than your original mission parameters." Thomas looked between the two sisters, both watching him with expressions that mixed amusement, challenge, and something that might have been affection. The bioscanner helpfully announced that his stress hormones had been replaced entirely by confusion and a strange sense of anticipation. "Well," he said finally, "my mother always told me I should be more adventurous in my career choices. I just don't think she had this specific scenario in mind." "Then you'll need to prepare for the council presentation," Vithais said, producing a data crystal that glowed with ominous efficiency. I've compiled everything you need to know about Velthari reproductive politics, royal succession mathematics, and the proper etiquette for explaining to three civilizations why human biology has just rewritten the rules of diplomatic engagement. Thomas accepted the crystal, feeling its weight like destiny made tangible. Outside the medical chamber's crystal windows, the three moons were beginning their evening alignment, casting the palace in the ethereal light that had started this entire impossible situation. The chamber of twin destinies resembled what Thomas imagined the inside of a cosmic calculator might look like. If cosmic calculators were designed by beings who considered mathematics a form of interpretive dance. Crystalline walls curved impossibly upward, their surfaces alive with equations that rewrote themselves in real time, solving problems that existed in dimensions he couldn't pronounce. "Breathe, Ambassador," Counselor Vithais whispered as they approached the quantum dais where the High Council waited. "Remember, you're not the first human to accidentally revolutionize interstellar diplomacy. You're just the first to do it through reproductive mishaps." "That's oddly reassuring," Thomas muttered, adjusting the ceremonial robes that had taken 3 Velthari tailors and a quantum physicist to properly fit his non-Euclidean proportions. The fabric seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously and kept trying to translate his nervous sweating into bioluminescent patterns. The assembled nobility of 3 star systems watched his approach with expressions ranging from curious fascination to barely contained amusement. Thomas recognized several species from his diplomatic briefings, including the crystalline Zephyrians who communicated through harmonic resonance and were currently humming what sounded like a betting song about his chances of survival. At the center of the chamber, Princess Lyrale and Princess Zyrale stood side by side, their matching ceremonial gowns flowing like captured starlight. Their ear markings pulsed in perfect synchronization, creating patterns that made the chamber's quantum processors chime with harmonic approval. "Members of the High Council," announced Elder Synthara, whose ancient voice carried the weight of 3 millennia and at least 2 galactic treaties. "We gather to resolve the matter of the accidental succession protocol, initiated by Ambassador Thomas Hartley of Earth through unprecedented biological diplomacy." Thomas stepped forward, trying to remember the 17 different bows he'd practiced for various species, while simultaneously not tripping over robes that obeyed physics he didn't understand. "Honored Council, I come before you to accept responsibility for the most elaborate diplomatic misunderstanding in recorded history." A ripple of what might have been laughter echoed through the chamber, though with some species it was hard to tell the difference between amusement and digestive processes. "The biological compatibility between human and Velthari genetics," Dr. Zephyrs announced, his medical scanner projecting holographic data that looked like abstract art with delusions of scientific accuracy, "has exceeded all theoretical parameters. The hybrid offspring will possess both quantum consciousness and traditional neural pathways, representing a potential evolutionary advancement for both species." "Furthermore," Lyrale added, her voice carrying across the chamber like crystalline music, "the pregnancy has triggered the ancient twin balance protocol, requiring both sisters to maintain reproductive synchronization to preserve royal succession rights." Thomas cleared his throat, a sound that the chamber's acoustics amplified into something resembling a cosmic hiccup. "If I may address the council directly, I've spent the last month learning about your culture, your people, and the breathtaking complexity of royal twin biology. What I've discovered is that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about bringing people together." He turned to face both sisters, their identical faces reflecting different aspects of the same impossible situation he'd stumbled into. "I came here as a diplomat, expecting to negotiate trade agreements and cultural exchanges. Instead, I found something I didn't know I was looking for." "And what was that?" Elder Synthara asked, her ancient eyes twinkling with curiosity that had survived the rise and fall of civilizations. A future I never could have imagined, Thomas replied, feeling the harmony stone Zyrale had given him pulse with warm energy against his chest. Princess Zyrale, you showed me how to think beyond linear constraints, how to embrace possibility instead of certainty. You taught me that love doesn't follow diplomatic protocols. Zyrale's ear markings flared with colors that painted aurora patterns across the chamber ceiling, her smile radiant enough to power a small star system. And Princess Lyrale, he continued, turning to the designated heir who had watched their courtship with patient grace, you demonstrated the kind of strength that holds civilizations together. Your willingness to consider this unprecedented situation shows wisdom that transcends species barriers. The question before us, interrupted Counselor Thane of the Outer Rim Territories, his cybernetic implants flickering with computational enthusiasm, is whether this biological development serves the greater good of interstellar relations or merely represents an amusing anecdote for future diplomatic historians. Why not both? Thomas asked, spreading his arms in a gesture that made his quantum robes shimmer with possibility. I propose that we embrace this situation as the foundation for something unprecedented, a true alliance between our species, built on understanding rather than mere political convenience. The two sisters stepped forward simultaneously, their movements so perfectly synchronized that Thomas wondered if they'd been practicing, or if twin telepathy was more literal than he'd realized. We have discussed this matter extensively, Lyrale announced, her formal diplomatic tone carrying undertones of warmth that made the chamber's crystal walls hum with approval. Through quantum entanglement and traditional sisterly conversation, Zyrale added with a grin that made several council members emit sounds that were definitely amusement in any language. And we have reached a consensus, they said in unison, their voices creating harmonies that resonated through dimensions Thomas was still learning to perceive. Lyrale stepped closer, her hand finding his with the kind of certainty that made diplomatic protocols seem quaint and unnecessary. Thomas Hartley of Earth, you have inadvertently solved a succession crisis, triggered an evolutionary leap, and convinced me that sometimes the best diplomatic solutions are the ones nobody sees coming. Therefore, Zyrale continued, taking his other hand while their unborn child made its presence known through quantum fluctuations that tickled his consciousness. We formally request Council approval for the Trispecies Alliance Protocol, with you as our mutual consort and the father of the next generation of hybrid leadership. The silence that followed was broken only by the chamber's quantum processors humming with what sounded suspiciously like cosmic approval. Elder Synthara rose from her crystal throne, her ancient form radiating the kind of authority that came from having witnessed the birth of star systems. In 3,000 years of diplomatic service, she announced, I have never encountered a situation quite like this one. Ambassador Hartley has managed to accidentally fulfill prophecies, solve succession crises, and bridge species barriers through the simple expedient of being completely out of his depth. Is that good or bad? Thomas whispered. In diplomatic terms, she replied with a smile that had negotiated peace treaties across half the galaxy, it's perfect. The Council's unanimous approval came in the form of harmonic resonance that made every crystal surface in the chamber ring like cosmic bells. Thomas found himself officially appointed as the first human Vilthari cultural ambassador, with responsibilities that included fathering the next generation of hybrid royalty and figuring out how to explain